Prince George is the largest city in northern British Columbia, Canada, with a population of 74,004 in the metropolitan area. It is often called the province's northern capital or sometimes the spruce capital because it is the hub city for northern BC. It is situated at the confluence of the Fraser and Nechako rivers, and at the crossroads of Highway 16 and Highway 97. The origins of Prince George can be traced to the Northwest Company Fur Trading Post of Fort George, which was established in 1807 by Simon Fraser and named in honor of King George III. The post was centered in the centuries-old homeland of the Lidley First Nation, whose very name means people of the confluence of the two rivers. The Lidley name began to see official use around the 1990s, and the band is otherwise historically referred to as Fort George Indian Band. Throughout the 19th century, HBC Fort George Trading Post remained unchanged, and Fort St. James reigned as the main trading post and capital of the New Caledonian area. Even during the Caribou Gold Rush, Fort George was isolated, although Quesnel prospered as the Caribou Road was built to its doorstep, making it the main staging area for the miners going to the goldfields at Barkerville. Then, when the Collins Overland Telegraph Trail was built in 1865–67, it bypassed Fort George Trading Post, following the Blackwater Trail from Quesnel and continuing northwest towards Hazelton. In the late 1800s, many Lidley lived in a village built next to the HBC Trading Post due to the ease of preparing furs and trading directly, without great distances to travel. Townsite development and the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. In 1903, the area's fortune began to change when reports said that the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, later part of Canadian National Railway, would pass near the fur trading post. In 1906, agricultural settlement began around the HBC post, and then in 1909, development of two townsites began as two rival land speculation companies built the communities of South Fort George and Fort George, sometimes referred to as Central Fort George. South Fort George was built on the Fraser River near to and just south of the Hudson's Bay Company's trading post. 6. The GTP meanwhile was trying to acquire land for its own townsite, which delayed the constructions of what would become Prince George for several years. Fort George townsite was built 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, to the northwest on the Nechako River. The name had been registered by the district lot original purchasers with some concerns due to its similarity to the HBC Trading Post's name. George Hammond, the CEO of the Natural Resources Security Company, bought 9 district lots and promoted his community of Fort George in exaggerated and questionable advertisements all over Canada and Britain, describing Fort George in glowing terms as being the future hub of British Columbia, the Chicago of the North. 6. And having mild winters and being suitable for any agricultural endeavor. Hammond claimed the existence of buildings and facilities in advertising when none existed at the time. 8. Lots sold in 1912 for $400, rising to $500 to $1,000 by 1913. South Fort George developed close to the near-defunct HBC post, along the Fraser River after being purchased in 1909 by the Northern Development Company, with lots going on sale in 1910. BC Express Company paddle wheelers landed in South Fort George and the area grew with speculation about the railway coming to the area. South Fort George would remain its own community until 1976, when it incorporated into the city of Prince George. Properties were sold in both of the town sites, with railway speculation driving up prices. By 1913, South Fort George and Fort George each had a population of around 1,500 and were booming as thousands of rail construction workers came to town for supplies and entertainment. Both communities believed that the Grand Trunk Pacific Station would be built in their town, and both were disappointed when the railway purchased the 1,366 acres, 5.53 square kilometers, of land in between them from the Lidley instead, even though Charles Vance Miller, then the owner of the BC Express Company, was well into negotiations to purchase that property himself. The railway compensated Miller by giving him 200 acres, 0.81 square kilometers, of the property, and, by 1914, when the railway was completed and the first train arrived, there were 4 major communities in the area: South Fort George Townsite, the Miller Addition and the railway's townsite, Prince George, where the station was built. Hammond also developed his lots further, including additions such as Central Fort George. Although George Hammond fought a series of bitter legal battles for a railway station in Fort George. The railway argued against a station in Fort George as it was their investment and risk, thus they would build a station in a town site of their own, Prince George. Plans for the town site for Prince George were created by Brett and Hall of Boston, and the land cleared in May 1913. Fort George, South Fort George, and Prince George pursued the right to incorporate with initial proposals including all three town sites. The GTP shows no interest in including Fort George, and South Fort George left the negotiations. The GTP lands, now known as the City of Prince George, were incorporated on March 6, 1915, following the borders of the 1,366 acres they had initially acquired. At this time, many owners of Prince George businesses, particularly ones on George Street, lived in South Fort George. As the Prince George town site developed and grew, many buildings were moved from the older town sites to the new business areas of Prince George, often being rolled into the city. In 1908, the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway identified the Reserve No. 1 land as an ideal area for a railway and station site, and attempted to claim all the 1,366 acres as needed for railway purposes, and thus circumvent negotiations with the Department of Indian Affairs. This was rejected. The Department of Indian Affairs wished to protect the Ledley Tener's interests but also supported railway development. By 1910 the Diane agent in the area was concerned about the influence of white settlers on the Ledley Tener, including the supply of liquor to the village and that civilization has overtaken them too rapidly. 6. Dyer Indian agent John McDougall however saw that the Ledley Tener had come to see the value of the land and employed that in negotiations. Between 1908 and 1911 several offers for the acquisition of the Reserve No. 1 lands were made by the GTP and others such as Charles Miller, of BC Express, who wanted to develop the land. The Department of Indian Affairs in conjunction with railroad representatives made several offers for the land. 6. In 1910 Chief Louis described the attachment to the land and village to McDougall, who reported that land, cash, and farm equipment would be needed to overcome resistance, and the band was considered to be averse to a sale. McDougall met with Chief Louis again in December 1910 offering $68,300, $50/acre, but Chief Louis told McDougall that they could not in their present mind surrender this reserve. A vote was held at a meeting 2 days later with members of the band over age 21. The vote approved the surrender of the reserve land 12-11, but Chief Louis asked to talk with his people and the band did not consider the vote final. The band appointed Oblate missionary E.C. Bellot as an emissary to Ottawa with a larger cash demand of $1,000 per acre, which was refused by Dyer representatives. Upon return to Fort George, a new vote by the band unanimously turned down the sale. During this time, the business developers of Fort George town site opposed the sale of the reserve lands as it would lead to its rival building a competing town, while South Fort George, which was built close to the old HBC post and the village, welcomed the railway and its town site. In 1911, federal Indian agent W.J. McCallan took on the negotiations with assistance from Reverend Father Cocola. Father Cocola conflicted role as he had interests in the well-being of the Ledley Tener but was also negotiating on behalf of the railway company which might connect to his mission on Stuart Lake. Father Cocola had wanted to relocate the Ledley Tener to a safer area where they would be away from settlers and could be schooled in agriculture and in religion. Cocola suggested to the band that if it tolerated intoxicating liquor and moral disorders, he would be the first to insist to have them removed. Cocola made several statements that he would convince or persuade the band to relocate if they refused offers, and even involved himself in pricing amounts that could be offers to the Ledley Tener. With several offers and refusals, the Ledley Tener saw a split in support for a land sale. Chief Louis favored the surrender of the land, but Joseph Quay, an influential leader in the band, wanted a higher price. On the 18th of November 1911, the Fort George Indian Band eventually agreed to sell the Reserve No. 1 lands for $125,000, 1/4 to be paid immediately, which included $25,000 for construction on Reserve No. 2 and No. 3 and the preservation of the original village cemetery. The band committed to relocate by June 1912. The vote for this agreement saw 32 in favor and 1 against, and 3 abstentions. The timeline was difficult to keep as new buildings had to be constructed. Delays in contracts being awarded by the government to build a new village meant that few could move by the deadline, and band members planted crops needed later in the year. The June 1912 payment was withheld as the Dyer saw the planting as refusal to leave. Chief Louis argued that the agreement stated that the payment was to be made in June and was not contingent on relocation. Winter was also coming and the crops would be needed if the new village was not built or supplies given to the band. The new village was completed in 1913 with band members moving there in September. The old village was destroyed to force the Indians away and ensure that it was not reoccupied. The Fort George Herald reported the destruction of the old village as the torch of the white man will be thrust into the remaining houses and the village will disappear quietly in a cloud of smoke. 6. Indian Agent W. J. McAllen's accounts of the situation reveal a need on his part and the part of the GTP to strong-arm the band members out, targeting 2 cabins in the village that were empty as the residents were away, hinting I knew that to set fire to the cabins would cause a flare-up of intense excitement and give me the break I needed, for a crisis had to be created before the deadlock could be broken.